In the rugged frontier of 1870s Wyoming, ranch foreman Jake Sullivan receives an unexpected inheritance from his deceased best friend Thomas Brennan, his entire ranch, but with one unusual condition. Jake must marry Thomas's mail-order bride, Catherine, who is already traveling west to fulfill her contract. Expecting a desperate woman seeking only security, Jake reluctantly agrees to honor his friend's dying wish. However, when the stagecoach arrives, he discovers Catherine is an educated, independent woman with her own reasons for heading west. As they navigate their arranged marriage on the unforgiving frontier, both must confront their preconceptions about each other while building something neither expected, a partnership that could become true love, if they can survive the challenges of the untamed West together. The Wyoming sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty main street of Cedar Ridge as Jake Sullivan adjusted his worn hat and checked his pocket watch for the third time in 5 minutes. The stagecoach was running late, carrying cargo that would change his life forever, a woman he'd never met but was bound by honor to marry. 3 weeks had passed since his best friend Thomas Brennan died in his arms, victim of a rattlesnake bite that no amount of whiskey or prayer could cure. Thomas had grabbed Jake's shirt with his last breath and whispered the words that now echoed in Jake's mind. "Promise me you'll take care of Catherine. Promise me you'll marry her when she arrives. She's got nowhere else to go." Jake had given his word, though every fiber of his being rebelled against the arrangement. At 32, he'd built a reputation as the most capable ranch foreman in 3 counties, but he'd also built walls around his heart that no woman had managed to breach. The frontier was no place for romance, and marriage was a luxury he'd never allowed himself to consider. Now standing outside Murphy's General Store with Thomas's last will and testament folded in his breast pocket, Jake wondered what kind of desperate woman would travel 1,500 miles to marry a stranger. The letter from the matrimonial agency had described Catherine O'Malley as suitable for frontier life and experienced in domestic duties, but those words painted the picture of a spinster seeking security rather than love. The sound of approaching hoofbeats and creaking wheels broke through his brooding thoughts. Jake straightened his shoulders and walked toward the edge of town where the stagecoach would stop. A small crowd had gathered. News traveled fast in a settlement of barely 300 souls, and everyone knew about Thomas's unusual bequest. "You sure about this, Jake?" called out Doc Williams, wiping his hands on a blood-stained apron as he emerged from his clinic. "Ain't too late to change your mind." Jake's jaw tightened. "A man's word is his bond, Doc. Thomas saved my life more than once. This is the least I can do for him." The stagecoach rounded the bend, its wooden wheels kicking up clouds of red dust. Driver Pete Morrison cracked his whip above the heads of the 4 exhausted horses as they pulled into the small station. The coach swayed to a stop, and Jake felt his stomach clench with nervous anticipation. Pete climbed down from his perch and tipped his hat. "Afternoon, Jake. Got your package here, along with a few other passengers." The door swung open, and Jake held his breath. First to emerge was a traveling salesman Jake recognized from previous visits, followed by an elderly woman clutching a carpet bag. Then a gloved hand appeared, grasping the doorframe, and Jake got his first glimpse of Catherine O'Malley. She was nothing like he'd imagined. Catherine stepped down from the coach with fluid grace, her dark green traveling dress modest but well-tailored, suggesting means beyond what he'd expected from a mail-order bride. Auburn hair was pinned back neatly beneath a matching hat, and when she turned to survey the town, Jake caught sight of intelligent green eyes that held no trace of the desperation he'd anticipated. She was beautiful, but more than that, she carried herself with a confidence that seemed completely at odds with her circumstances. This was not a woman fleeing poverty or scandal. This was a woman who'd made a calculated decision, and Jake found that somehow more unsettling than if she'd been exactly what he'd expected. Catherine's gaze swept across the gathered townspeople before settling on Jake. Recognition flickered in her eyes. Perhaps Pete had pointed him out, or maybe Thomas had described him in his letters. She walked toward him with measured steps, her chin held high despite the curious stares of the onlookers. "Mr. Sullivan." Her voice carried a slight Irish accent, melodic but controlled. "I'm Catherine O'Malley. I believe you were expecting me." Jake removed his hat and nodded curtly. "Ma'am, I'm sorry for your loss. Thomas spoke of you often." The lie came easily. Thomas had mentioned his mail-order bride only in passing and never by name. "Thank you." Catherine's expression remained composed, but Jake caught a flicker of something. Grief, perhaps, or disappointment. "I understand there have been some changes to our arrangement." "Yes, ma'am. Thomas asked me to honor his commitment to you. If you're willing, we can proceed to the church. Reverend Matthews is waiting." For the first time since stepping off the stagecoach, Catherine's composure cracked slightly. Her gloved hands tightened around her reticule, and she glanced back at the coach as if considering her options. I see. And if I'm not willing? The question hung in the air between them. Jake had assumed she'd be grateful for any offer of marriage and security, but Catherine O'Malley was clearly a woman accustomed to having choices. Then Pete will take you back to Cheyenne on tomorrow's coach, and I'll pay your fare wherever you want to go. Catherine studied his face for a long moment as if weighing his sincerity. The crowd around them had grown restless, sensing drama in the unexpected delay. Before I decide, Catherine said finally, I'd like to know something about the man I'm being asked to marry. Thomas wrote that you were his dearest friend and the most honorable man he'd ever known. But honor alone doesn't make a marriage. Jake felt heat rise in his cheeks. He'd expected gratitude, not an interrogation. What would you like to know? Why did you agree to this arrangement? Surely a man in your position could find a wife through more conventional means. The directness of her question caught him off guard. Around them, the townspeople leaned in, clearly fascinated by this turn of events. Thomas was like a brother to me, Jake said carefully. He saved my life during an Apache raid 5 years ago. When he asked me to take care of you, I gave my word. That's all there is to it. I see. Catherine's green eyes never left his face. And what exactly does taking care of me entail in your mind, Mr. Sullivan? Jake's discomfort was growing by the minute. This conversation should have taken place in private, not as entertainment for half the town. You'd have a home, food, protection, he said. All the security Thomas intended to provide, but not a husband in any real sense. The blunt statement hung between them like a challenge. Jake felt every eye in the crowd upon him as he struggled to find the right words. Ma'am, I'm not sure this is the place for such a discussion. Catherine glanced around at their audience and nodded. You're quite right. Perhaps we could speak privately before making any decisions? Jake gestured toward Murphy's store. We could use the back room. Murphy won't mind. As they walked toward the store, Jake caught fragments of whispered conversations among the onlookers. This wasn't how he'd imagined this day would go, and he had the unsettling feeling that Catherine O'Malley was about to upend every assumption he'd made about their arrangement. The back room of Murphy's store smelled of coffee beans and leather goods. Catherine took the offered chair while Jake remained standing, his hat still in his hands. Now then, Catherine said, folding her hands in her lap. Let's speak plainly, shall we? Like this video if you're enjoying this Western tale, subscribe for more frontier stories, and comment below to let us know where in the world you're watching from. I appreciate your directness, Miss O'Malley, Jake began, setting his hat on a nearby barrel. Though I admit I'm not sure where to start. Perhaps with the truth, Catherine replied, her green eyes never wavering from his face. You agreed to marry me out of obligation to your friend, not out of any desire for a wife. Is that correct? Jake shifted uncomfortably. Most women would have been offended by such an arrangement, but Catherine spoke as if she were negotiating a business contract. That's accurate, he admitted. Thomas made me promise, and I don't break my promises. Good. I respect that quality in a man. Catherine smoothed her skirts and continued. Now I should tell you that I didn't travel 1,500 miles seeking a love match either. Thomas and I corresponded for 6 months, and our arrangement was quite practical in nature. This revelation surprised Jake. He'd assumed any woman willing to become a mail-order bride must be desperately romantic or desperately poor. If you don't mind my asking what brought you to such an arrangement, you seem, he paused, searching for the right words, well-educated, capable of supporting yourself. A shadow crossed Catherine's face. I was a school teacher in Boston. My father died last year, leaving debts that consumed everything. My position was eliminated when the school board decided a woman with financial troubles couldn't be trusted around children. Apparently, desperation might drive me to steal. The bitterness in her voice was unmistakable, and Jake felt an unexpected surge of anger on her behalf. He'd seen enough injustice on the frontier to recognize it when he heard it. That's a damn fool reason to dismiss a good teacher, he said bluntly. Catherine's eyebrows rose slightly at his language, but she didn't seem offended. Yes, well, Boston society has very particular ideas about propriety. When Thomas's letter arrived through the matrimonial agency, it seemed like providence. He offered respect, security, and the chance to teach children who actually needed education rather than mere social polish. And now I find myself in an even stranger situation than I'd originally accepted. Catherine leaned forward slightly. Mr. Sullivan, I need to know your intentions. If we marry, what would our arrangement actually be? Jake rubbed the back of his neck, wishing Thomas were there to explain what he'd gotten them both into. I haven't given it much thought beyond honoring my promise. You'd live at the ranch. It's a good-sized spread with a comfortable house. You'd have your own room, of course. I'd expect nothing from you that you weren't willing to give. And children? The question hit Jake like a physical blow. He'd never seriously considered having children. The frontier was too dangerous, too unpredictable. But looking at Catherine's composed face, he realized she was thinking practically about every aspect of their potential future. I hadn't considered that, he admitted. I see. Catherine was quiet for a moment, and Jake found himself studying her profile. Despite her practical demeanor, there was something almost fragile about the line of her jaw, the way she held herself so carefully erect. May I ask you something, Mr. Sullivan? Jake, he corrected automatically. And yes. Why haven't you married? You're clearly established, respected in the community. Surely there were opportunities. Jake looked away, focusing on a saddle hanging from the wall. It was a fair question, but not one he enjoyed answering. The frontier takes what it wants, he said finally. I've seen too many good women die in childbirth, too many children orphaned by disease or violence. Marriage seemed like a risk I wasn't willing to take, and yet you're willing to take it now. For Thomas, yes. Catherine stood and walked to the small window overlooking the main street. Jake could see her reflection in the glass, her expression thoughtful. I should tell you, she said without turning around, that I have certain expectations about marriage, even a practical one, such as respect, honesty, the right to maintain some independence within reason. She turned back to face him. I won't be a servant in my own home, and I won't tolerate being treated as property. Jake felt a spark of admiration for her directness. I wouldn't expect anything less. The ranch needs capable hands, and from what Thomas wrote, you're more than qualified. He wrote to you about me? Some. Said you were intelligent, hardworking, and not afraid of challenges. Jake paused. He also said you had a good laugh and could outthink most men he'd known. For the first time since stepping off the stagecoach, Catherine smiled. A real smile that transformed her entire face. Thomas was kind in his letters, perhaps overly so. The smile faded as quickly as it had appeared. Mr. Sullivan, Jake, I need to know one more thing before I decide. What's that? Can you honestly say you're prepared to build something real with me? Not just honor a promise, but actually try to make a life together? Catherine's voice was steady, but Jake caught the vulnerability beneath her words. Because I won't marry a man who sees me as nothing more than an obligation to be endured. The question hung between them in the dusty air of the storage room. Outside, Jake could hear the normal sounds of the town. Horses, voices, the creak of wagon wheels. Normal life continuing while his own stood balanced on the edge of irrevocable change. He looked at Catherine O'Malley, really looked at her, and saw not the desperate mail-order bride he'd expected, but a woman of substance who'd faced adversity with courage and dignity. She deserved better than a marriage born solely of duty. I can try, he said finally. I can't promise love, but I can promise respect. And effort. Catherine nodded slowly. Then I believe we understand each other, Jake Sullivan. She extended her hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Jake took it. Her grip was firm, her palm warm through the cotton gloves. Shall we proceed to the church? Catherine asked. Are you certain? Once we're married, there's no going back easily. I've never been one to look backward, Catherine replied. Besides, I suspect we're both more practical than romantic. That might be exactly what this arrangement needs. As they prepared to leave the storage room, Jake found himself wondering if Catherine O'Malley might be right. Perhaps their practical approach would prove more durable than passion alone. He was about to find out. The wedding ceremony at Cedar Ridge's small wooden church was unlike anything Jake had imagined for himself. Reverend Matthews, a kindly man with graying whiskers, had hastily gathered a handful of witnesses from among the townspeople who'd lingered after Catherine's arrival. Mrs. Henderson, the schoolmaster's wife, stood as Catherine's witness, while Doc Williams reluctantly agreed to stand for Jake. Dearly beloved, Reverend Matthews began, his voice echoing in the modest sanctuary. We are gathered here today to witness the union of Jacob Sullivan and Catherine O'Malley in holy matrimony. Jake found himself stealing glances at his bride throughout the brief ceremony. Catherine stood straight and composed, her hands steady as she held a small bouquet of wildflowers that Mrs. Henderson had quickly gathered from behind the church. Her voice was clear and unwavering as she spoke her vows, though Jake noticed she kept her eyes fixed on the Reverend rather than looking at him directly. When the time came to exchange rings, Jake realized with embarrassment that he had nothing to offer. Catherine, however, quietly slipped a simple gold band from her own finger, a piece that had clearly belonged to her mother. judging by its worn elegance, and handed it to the Reverend to bless. "With this ring I thee wed," Jake said, sliding the band onto Catherine's finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been meant for her all along. "You may kiss the bride," Reverend Matthews announced with a gentle smile. Jake hesitated for a moment before leaning down to brush his lips briefly against Catherine's cheek. It was a chaste kiss, appropriate for their practical arrangement, but he caught a hint of lavender from her hair that stirred something unexpected in his chest. The small congregation offered polite congratulations as they signed the marriage certificate. Mrs. Henderson pressed a wrapped bundle into Catherine's hands. "Just some biscuits and preserves for your first meal together, dear," while Doc Williams clapped Jake on the shoulder with what might have been sympathy. As they walked out into the afternoon sunshine, Jake realized he had no clear plan for what came next. The ranch was a 2-hour ride from town, and Catherine was hardly dressed for such a journey. "I arranged for a room at the boarding house," Catherine said quietly, as if reading his thoughts. "I assumed we wouldn't be traveling to the ranch today." "That's practical," Jake replied, then felt foolish for stating the obvious. "I'll stable my horse and we can, well, I suppose we should discuss arrangements." The boarding house was run by Martha Kowalski, a Polish immigrant whose husband had died in a mining accident 3 years prior. She'd built a reputation for discretion and comfortable accommodations, making it the natural choice for travelers who could afford better than the rough saloon rooms. "Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Sullivan," Martha said warmly, as she handed them the key to the largest room. "I've prepared the bridal suite. Fresh linens, hot water for washing, and I'll have supper ready at 6 if you'd like." Jake felt heat rise in his neck at the implications of the bridal suite, but Catherine accepted the key with gracious composure. "Thank you, Mrs. Kowalski. That's very thoughtful." The room was indeed prepared for newlyweds, with flower petals scattered across the bed's white quilt and candles arranged on the small table by the window. Jake stood awkwardly by the door while Catherine set down her traveling bag and looked around the space. "I can sleep in the stable," Jake said abruptly. "Or perhaps Mrs. Kowalski has another room available." Catherine turned to face him, one eyebrow raised. "That would certainly give the townspeople something to talk about, wouldn't it? The groom who couldn't bear to spend his wedding night under the same roof as his bride." "I don't want you to feel uncomfortable," Jake said. "I appreciate that, but I'm not made of spun glass, Jake. We're both adults who've entered into this arrangement with clear expectations." Catherine gestured toward the bed. "You take the bed. I'll make a pallet by the window. It won't be the first time I've slept on hard ground." The matter-of-fact way she addressed their sleeping arrangements both relieved and unsettled Jake. Most brides would have been either terrified or indignant at the situation, but Catherine simply began arranging blankets as if she were setting up camp on the trail. "Tell me about the ranch," Catherine said as she worked. "What should I expect tomorrow?" Jake settled into the room's single chair, grateful for the distraction of practical conversation. "It's about 2,000 acres, mostly grazing land for cattle. The house is solid. Thomas built it himself with help from the hands. 3 bedrooms, a good kitchen, a parlor with a stone fireplace. There's a vegetable garden that's been neglected since Thomas got sick, and a small orchard. How many ranch hands?" 4 regulars, plus seasonal help during roundups. Good men, all of them. They respected Thomas, and they'll respect you as long as you prove yourself capable." Catherine paused in her arrangements. "And if I don't prove myself capable, then we'll face that problem when we come to it," Jake said honestly. "But from what I've seen today, I don't think that's likely to be an issue." A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Jake opened it to find Martha Kowalski holding a tray with coffee and sandwiches. "I thought you might be hungry," she said with a knowing smile, "and I wanted to let you know that Dr. Williams mentioned your wife is a school teacher. We've been without a teacher for nearly a year since Miss Peterson married and moved to Denver. The school board would be very interested in speaking with her." Catherine looked up with obvious interest. "What age children?" 6 to 15, usually about 20 students total. The schoolhouse needs some repair work, but it's structurally sound. Pay isn't much, but it would be steady income." After Martha left, Catherine sat on the edge of the bed with obvious excitement. "I hadn't dared hope there might be teaching opportunities so soon." "Thomas was right," Jake said. "The children here do need proper education. Most of the parents can barely read themselves. Would you mind if I took the position?" The question surprised Jake. He'd assumed Catherine would want to work, given her background, but her asking his permission reminded him that as her husband, he now had legal authority over such decisions. "I'd mind if you didn't take it," he said firmly. "Your skills are needed here, and keeping busy will make the adjustment easier for both of us." As the sun set outside their window, Jake found himself reassessing everything he'd expected about married life. Catherine O'Malley, now Catherine Sullivan, was proving to be full of surprises, and he was beginning to suspect that honoring Thomas's dying wish might turn out to be less of a burden than he'd feared. Perhaps in time, it might even prove to be a blessing. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, with the promise of a beautiful autumn day. Catherine woke before Jake, quietly dressing in her most practical traveling outfit, a dark blue wool dress with a shorter skirt suitable for riding. She'd braided her auburn hair tightly and pinned it securely beneath a simple bonnet, preparing herself for the journey to what would now be her home. Jake stirred as she was lacing her boots. "You're an early riser," he observed, sitting up and running a hand through his dark hair. "Old habit from teaching. Children require punctuality." Catherine straightened and smoothed her skirts. "I've been thinking about the logistics of moving to the ranch. My trunk is still at the depot. We'll collect it on our way out of town. I've arranged for a wagon. Figured it would be more comfortable for you than riding horseback for 2 hours." After a simple breakfast of eggs and biscuits at Martha's table, they made their way to Murphy's store to gather Catherine's belongings and purchase supplies. Several townspeople nodded politely as they passed, word of their marriage having spread quickly through Cedar Ridge's small population. "Mrs. Sullivan," called a voice from across the street. A tall, thin man in a black coat approached them with purposeful strides. "I'm Samuel Morrison, chairman of the school board. Mrs. Kowalski mentioned you might be interested in our teaching position." Catherine's eyes lit up with interest. "Indeed I am, Mr. Morrison, though I should mention I haven't yet seen the schoolhouse or learned about the specific needs of your students. Would you have time this morning for a brief tour? The children are eager to resume their education, and we're equally eager to find a qualified instructor." Jake checked the position of the sun. "We can spare an hour," he said, "but I'd like to reach the ranch before evening." The schoolhouse stood at the edge of town, a modest one-room building with windows on 3 sides and a small bell tower. Inside, Catherine found wooden desks arranged in neat rows, a large slate board at the front, and shelves lined with well-worn textbooks. "The previous teacher left behind most of her materials," Morrison explained. "Books, slates, chalk. The older children help with the younger ones, which has been necessary given our irregular teaching situation." Catherine walked slowly around the room, running her fingers along the desk surfaces and examining the books. Jake watched her transform before his eyes. Her posture straightened, her voice took on an authoritative tone, and her eyes sparkled with genuine enthusiasm. "What subjects are typically covered?" she asked. "Reading, writing, arithmetic, basic geography, and history. Some of the older boys receive additional instruction in practical mathematics for commerce and land management. And the girls?" Morrison looked uncomfortable. "Well, the usual domestic skills naturally. Sewing, basic cookery, household management." "I see." Catherine's tone remained neutral, but Jake caught the slight tightening around her eyes. "When would classes begin?" "Monday next, if you're willing. The pay is $30 monthly plus a small budget for supplies." It wasn't much money, but Jake could see Catherine calculating how far it might stretch. In Boston, she'd probably earned more, but here it represented genuine independence. "I'll need Sunday to prepare lesson plans and organize materials," Catherine said. "But yes, Mr. Morrison, I accept the position." After completing the arrangements, they loaded Catherine's trunk and several crates of supplies into the wagon Jake had rented. The ride to the ranch gave Catherine her first real view of the country that would be her new home. The landscape was vast and open, with rolling hills covered in golden grass that swayed in the autumn breeze. Cattle dotted the pastures in small groups, and Jake pointed out the boundaries of his property as they traveled. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks already dusted with early snow. "It's beautiful," Catherine said, and Jake was surprised to hear genuine appreciation in her voice. "So much space. In Boston, you could barely see the sky for all the buildings." "Gets lonely sometimes," Jake admitted, "especially in winter when the snow keeps you close to the house for weeks at a time. I'm not afraid of solitude. Some of my happiest hours were spent reading by the fire while storms raged outside." As they crested a low hill, the Sullivan Ranch spread out before them. The house was larger than Catherine had expected, a 2-story structure built from local stone and timber, with a wide porch and several outbuildings clustered nearby. Smoke rose from the chimney, indicating someone was keeping the fires burning. "Miguel Santos manages the day-to-day operations," Jake explained as they approached. "His wife Elena keeps house and cooks for the hands. They've been with the ranch for 8 years. Good people." A man emerged from the barn as they pulled up to the house. Miguel Santos was compact and weathered, with graying hair and intelligent brown eyes. He approached the wagon with obvious curiosity. "Miguel, I'd like you to meet my wife, Catherine," Jake said as he helped her down from the wagon. "Catherine? Miguel runs this place better than I do." Miguel removed his hat and nodded respectfully. "Welcome to the ranch, Mrs. Sullivan. Elena is inside preparing supper. She's very excited to have another woman around." "I'm looking forward to meeting her," Catherine replied warmly. As they unloaded her trunk, Jake noticed Catherine studying everything with careful attention. The condition of the buildings, the organization of the work areas, the quality of the animals visible in the corrals. She wasn't just observing, she was evaluating, and he found himself wondering what conclusions she was drawing. Elena Santos proved to be a small, energetic woman with kind eyes and work-roughened hands. She greeted Catherine with genuine warmth, immediately launching into rapid Spanish before catching herself and switching to careful English. "Perdón, señora. I am so happy to have you here. This house, it needs a woman's touch again." The interior of the house was comfortable but clearly masculine in its appointments. Heavy wooden furniture, practical rather than decorative, and a noticeable absence of the small touches that made a house feel like a home. Catherine took it all in without comment, but Jake could almost see her making mental notes about changes that might be needed. "I'll show you to your room," Jake said, leading her up the stairs to a spacious bedroom with windows facing east and south. "Thomas used this room when he was ill. I thought you might prefer the morning light." Catherine set down her traveling bag and looked around the space. It contained a large bed, a wardrobe, a writing desk, and a comfortable reading chair by the window. "It's perfect," she said simply. "Thank you." As Jake prepared to leave her to settle in, Catherine turned to face him. "Jake, I want you to know that I don't expect you to change your entire life to accommodate me. I understand this is your home, your routine, your business. I'll do my best to fit in without disrupting what already works." Jake paused in the doorway, struck by her consideration. Most people, men or women, would have immediately begun making demands about how things should be different, better, more to their liking. "And I want you to know that this is your home now too," he replied. "If something doesn't work for you, speak up. We're partners in this, Catherine. That has to mean something." As he closed the door behind him, Jake found himself thinking that perhaps this arrangement might work better than either of them had dared hope. Outside, the sun was setting over the ranch, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. It struck him that it was the first sunset of his married life, and somehow that seemed significant. Catherine's first week at the ranch passed in a blur of adjustment and discovery. She rose each morning before dawn, a habit ingrained from years of managing a Boston classroom, and found that the early hours offered her the quiet time she needed to plan lessons and organize her thoughts. Elena proved to be an invaluable ally, teaching Catherine the rhythms of ranch life with patient good humor. Together they worked in the vegetable garden, salvaging what remained of the late harvest and preparing the soil for next spring's planting. "Senora Catherine," Elena said one morning as they picked the last of the tomatoes, "you work very hard. In Boston you did not have garden?" "No garden, no," Catherine replied, wiping dirt from her hands. "Only a small window box with herbs. Everything else came from the market." Elena clicked her tongue sympathetically. "Here, we grow what we eat. Is better, see? You know where food comes from." Catherine found unexpected satisfaction in the physical work. Her hands, once soft from city living, began to develop calluses, and her shoulders grew strong from hauling water and lifting heavy baskets. Jake watched this transformation with growing admiration, though he was careful not to comment on it directly. The ranch hands, Miguel, his brother Carlos, young Pete Murphy from town, and old Sam Hendricks, were initially wary of the new mistress of the house. They'd respected Thomas Sullivan, but a woman from the East was an unknown quantity. Catherine seemed to understand their reserve and made no attempts to immediately insert herself into their work routines. Instead, she observed quietly, learning their names, their responsibilities, and their individual personalities. When Pete's horse threw a shoe and came up lame, Catherine offered to drive him to town in the wagon so he could collect the animal later. When Carlos mentioned his daughter was struggling with reading, Catherine quietly arranged to leave some beginner books where the child might find them. Her teaching position began on Monday, exactly as planned. Jake drove her to town that first morning, wanting to ensure she was properly settled before leaving her to manage on her own. 23 students, Catherine told him as they approached the schoolhouse, ages 6 to 15. "Mr. Morrison warned me that discipline has been inconsistent during the months without regular instruction. Need me to speak with any of the parents?" Jake offered. Catherine smiled, and Jake realized it was the first time he'd seen her look genuinely amused rather than merely polite. I think I can manage a classroom full of children, Jake. I've been doing it for 8 years. Inside the schoolhouse, Catherine found chaos. The older boys had clearly been taking advantage of the lack of supervision, while the younger children seemed lost and unfocused. Several girls sat in a corner, apparently excluded from any organized learning. Catherine stood at the front of the room and waited. The noise gradually died down as the children became aware of her presence. "Good morning," she said clearly. "I am Mrs. Sullivan, and I will be your teacher. We're going to begin by establishing some basic expectations." By the end of that first day, Catherine had separated the students into appropriate learning groups, assessed their individual skill levels, and established a routine that would allow her to provide instruction to multiple age groups simultaneously. She also made it clear that every child, boy or girl, would receive the same quality of education. When Jake returned to collect her that evening, he found Catherine organizing papers at her desk while several students swept the floor and arranged chairs. "Thank you, Mary, Billy," Catherine said to the children. "I'll see you tomorrow." "How did it go?" Jake asked as they walked to the wagon. "Better than expected. They're hungry for learning, even the ones who pretend they're not. Give me a month and I'll have them reading at grade level." That evening at dinner, Elena served her famous beef stew while Catherine described her first day to the assembled household. Miguel and Jake listened with interest as she outlined her plans for improving the students' mathematics skills and introducing them to basic science concepts. "The older boys have been helping their fathers with ranch work and business calculations," she said. "They're actually quite advanced in practical mathematics, even if they struggle with formal arithmetic. I plan to build on that foundation." "And the girls?" Jake asked. Catherine's expression grew thoughtful. "The girls have been taught that their education ends with basic reading and domestic skills. I intend to change that. Every child deserves the opportunity to develop their full potential." Miguel nodded approvingly. "My Elena, she is very smart, could read and write in Spanish before we married, but no one taught her English reading until she learned herself." "Would Elena be interested in joining an evening class for adults?" Catherine asked suddenly. "I could teach English reading and writing to anyone who's interested." Elena's eyes lit up with excitement, and she began speaking rapidly in Spanish to Miguel. He translated with a grin. "She says yes, very much yes, and she thinks other women in town would also be interested." As the days passed, Catherine's presence began to transform not just the schoolhouse but the entire community. Parents who had never shown interest in their children's education started asking questions about homework and progress. Women began approaching her about the possibility of evening classes. At the ranch, subtle changes were taking place as well. Catherine's practical nature and organizational skills brought order to aspects of household management that had been neglected since Thomas's illness. She reorganized the pantry, established regular schedules for laundry and cleaning, and even suggested improvements to the barn layout that would make feeding the cattle more efficient. Jake found himself looking forward to their evening conversations over dinner. Catherine had strong opinions about everything from cattle breeding to territorial politics, and she wasn't afraid to challenge his assumptions when she disagreed with his reasoning. "You're thinking like a rancher," she said one evening as they discussed plans for next year's spring planting. "But you're not considering the economic implications of the railroad extension. When the tracks reach Cedar Ridge, everything changes. Land values, shipping costs, market accessibility. You think we should expand the operation? I think you should diversify. Cattle will always be profitable, but what about horses? Training stock for the cavalry units? Or developing a breeding program for quality saddle horses?" Jake stared at her across the dinner table, struck by the sophistication of her thinking. "Where did you learn about horse breeding?" "My father managed a stable in Boston before he died. I grew up around horses and I understand bloodlines and training methods." Catherine paused, then added quietly, "I've been watching your animals, Jake. You have excellent stock, but you're not maximizing their potential." It was moments like these that reminded Jake how little he actually knew about his wife. Every day seemed to reveal new depths to Catherine O'Malley Sullivan, and he was beginning to realize that Thomas's choice had been far more insightful than he'd initially understood. That night, as he sat on the porch listening to the sounds of the ranch settling down for the night, Jake found himself thinking about the future with a sense of anticipation rather than mere obligation. Catherine had kept every promise she'd made during their wedding day conversation. She'd proven herself capable, independent, and supportive without being demanding. More than that, she'd brought intelligence and fresh perspective to challenges he'd been facing alone for too long. 3 weeks into their marriage, Jake was beginning to suspect that honoring Thomas's dying wish might turn out to be the best decision he'd ever made. Whether Catherine felt the same way remained to be seen, but Jake found himself genuinely hoping that their practical arrangement might eventually grow into something deeper and more meaningful. For the first time since Thomas's death, the future looked bright. The first snow of winter arrived early that year, blanketing the ranch in pristine white that transformed the familiar landscape into something magical. Catherine stood at the kitchen window, watching Jake and Miguel work to bring the cattle closer to the barn, their breath visible in the crisp morning air. "Storm coming?" Elena said, joining her at the window. "Jake, he worries about you getting to school in this weather." It had been 6 weeks since their wedding, and Catherine had established herself as an indispensable part of both the ranch and the community. Her evening classes for adults had grown to include 12 women and 3 men, including Elena, who was progressing rapidly in her English reading skills. The school board had already approached Catherine about continuing her position permanently, impressed by the dramatic improvements in student performance and behavior. Even the most skeptical parents had been won over when their children began demonstrating knowledge and skills they'd never expected to see. Jake entered the kitchen, stamping snow from his boots and pulling off his heavy coat. "Road's getting bad," he announced. "I don't think you should try to make it to town today." Catherine nodded, having already reached the same conclusion. "I'll send word with Pete when he goes in for supplies. The children will understand." "Actually," Jake said, hanging his coat on a peg by the door, "I've been meaning to talk to you about something." Something in his tone made Catherine look at him more carefully. Over the past weeks, she'd learned to read the subtle changes in his expression, the way his voice shifted when he was working up to saying something important. "What is it?" Jake poured himself coffee and sat down at the kitchen table, gesturing for Catherine to join him. Elena, with the intuitive discretion she'd perfected over years of managing a household, quietly withdrew to the pantry. "The Morrison place is for sale," Jake said without preamble. 500 acres adjacent to our southern boundary. Good water, excellent pasture." Catherine waited, sensing there was more. "The price is fair, but it would require most of our cash reserves plus a bank loan. It's a risk." Jake met her eyes directly. "But it's also an opportunity to double our operation and secure the ranch's future for the next generation." The phrase "next generation" hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither had yet addressed directly. "What do you need from me?" Catherine asked simply. Jake was quiet for a long moment, and Catherine realized this conversation was about more than land purchases. "When I married you," he said finally, "I thought I was fulfilling an obligation to my best friend. I expected exactly what we agreed on, a practical arrangement that would benefit us both without requiring anything deeper." Catherine's heart began to beat faster, but she kept her expression neutral. "And now? Now I find myself consulting you on every major decision because your judgment is better than mine. I look forward to our conversations more than anything else in my day. I worry about your safety when you're away from the ranch, and I feel proud when I see how much the community respects you." Jake stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered landscape. "What I'm trying to say, Catherine, is that this marriage has become real for me. Not just a legal arrangement, but a true partnership. And if we're going to make major financial decisions that will affect our future, I need to know if you feel the same way." Catherine rose and moved to stand beside him at the window. For weeks, she'd been wrestling with her own changing feelings, uncertain how to navigate the transformation from reluctant bride to devoted wife. "When I accepted your proposal," she said quietly, "I thought I was trading one form of independence for another. I expected to live parallel lives under the same roof, cordial but separate." She turned to face him directly. "But Jake, what we've built together is nothing like what I expected. You've never tried to limit my independence or control my choices. You've encouraged my teaching, supported my ideas, and treated me as an equal partner in every aspect of ranch life." Jake's expression grew hopeful, but he remained silent, waiting for her to continue. "I've spent weeks trying to convince myself that what I'm feeling is just gratitude or practical appreciation for our successful arrangement." Catherine's voice grew stronger, more certain. "But that's not what this is. Somewhere between planning lessons at your kitchen table and watching you work with those horses, I fell in love with my husband." The words hung between them for a moment before Jake closed the distance, taking her hands in his calloused ones. "I love you too, Catherine. I think I started falling for you that first night when you stood up to me about working and refusing to be dependent. You were nothing like I feared you'd be. You're everything I never dared hope for." When Jake kissed her, it was with the warmth and passion of a man claiming his beloved wife, not the polite restraint of a husband fulfilling his obligations. "So," Catherine said when they broke apart, her cheeks flushed and her eyes bright, "about the Morrison place. What are the specific terms of the loan and what's our timeline for making a decision? Jake laughed, the sound full of joy and amazement. You want to discuss business right now? We're partners, remember? Equal partners. Besides, Catherine smiled mischievously, we have all winter to explore the other aspects of our marriage. Right now, I want to help you build an empire. 3 hours later, they'd spread maps and financial documents across the kitchen table, planning their expansion with the enthusiasm of true collaborators. Elena served them lunch while they calculated feed costs and pasture rotation schedules, occasionally offering practical suggestions based on her years of ranch experience. The evening classes could expand too, Catherine said, making notes in the margins of their planning documents. If we're bringing in more families to work the expanded operation, their children will need education, and the adults might want to improve their English skills. Teacher and ranch partner, Jake said admiringly. Is there anything you can't do? I'm a terrible cook, Catherine admitted. Elena has been very patient about that shortcoming. Elena loves cooking for people who appreciate it, Jake replied. And I love having a wife who can calculate compound interest and plan breeding schedules. As the snow continued to fall outside, Catherine felt a profound sense of contentment settle over her. 6 weeks ago, she'd been a desperate spinster accepting a marriage proposal from a stranger to avoid destitution. Now she was a beloved wife, respected teacher, and equal partner in building something meaningful and lasting. Thomas Sullivan's dying wish had indeed been fulfilled, but not in the way any of them had expected. Instead of a burden grudgingly accepted, it had become a gift that transformed two lonely people into a family. Jake, Catherine said as they prepared to make their final decision about the land purchase, do you think Thomas knew? When he asked you to marry me, do you think he suspected we might actually fall in love? Jake considered the question seriously. Thomas was the smartest man I ever knew, and he cared about both of us deeply. I think he saw something we were too stubborn or too scared to see ourselves. Looking around the warm kitchen with its evidence of shared meals and collaborative planning, with Elena humming contentedly as she prepared dinner, and the sound of the ranch hands returning from their work in the snow, Catherine realized that she'd found something she'd never even known she was looking for. She'd found home. She'd found love. She'd found her place in the world. And it was everything she'd never dared dream it could be. The end.